work forward. With that, I would now like to invite EAN's Executive Director, Jared Duval, to the stage.
Good morning, everybody. It's so good to see you all. So the first thing that I want to say is the main event for this summit is coming later this afternoon. We had an incredible response when we put out a call to say, now's the time. We have to make breakthrough progress if we're going to meet our energy and climate commitments. We had 24 member organizations respond with pitches or proposals of ideas that could help us make breakthrough progress to those goals. That's going to be most of the afternoon. Before we get to that, and before we get to some remarks from public partners, et cetera, I just want to take a little bit of time to set some shared context for our work together that should inform the way that we assess those pitches and really where we're starting from. One of the things I want to say before I start is that this is not my presentation. It was made and created by the combined wisdom and expertise of many people in this room. A lot of it comes from infographics and data and analysis that many of you are probably pretty familiar with from our 2018 annual progress report. So I particularly want to thank Lee Seddon, our board chair, Linda McGinnis, senior fellow, Sarah Wolf, who had worked with EAN and is now with Efficiency Vermont, and Dave Roberts from VEIC, on and on. There are so many people who contributed ideas, data analysis to put this together. The other thing I should say at the outset is most of the data that you will see does not come from EAN. We partner with state departments and agencies to collect the information to be able to track our progress in a comprehensive, holistic way. So for instance, and actually when I say your name, if you wouldn't mind standing up just in case people don't know you. So a lot of the emissions data that you will see comes from the Agency of Natural Resources. Colin Smythe, who is with the Department of Environmental Conservation, works on the state's emissions inventory. So thank you, Colin. Deputy Secretary Peter Walk will be here as well. We also work really closely with the Public Service Department, especially around data from the electricity sector. Deputy Commissioner Riley Allen either is or will be here, Ann Margolis. Andrew Perchlik is here. Data from VTrans, I see Dan Dutcher right there. And the Agency of Commerce and Community Development, you'll see analysis and data in here from Ken Jones, the agency's research analyst. So this really is a combined effort that you see. And appropriately, because it is that, basically everything that you see is available for you to use on EAN's website. So if you want a short 20-minute presentation that has the high points of this report, or if you want a longer, more in-depth presentation, you can go onto the website and download it. All the notes are there. You can give a very similar presentation if you'd like. So with that, I want to say that the approach of this presentation and our approach generally as a staff and as a network is this path. Follow the data, get the best available official data. We do that at a federal level from EIA, we do it at a state level with partners. Listen to evidence-based expertise. What are peer-reviewed studies saying? What are the proven best practices? And then we share with you across the network and with our public partners, not only that data and what we're learning, but the careful, honest, and actionable analysis that is hopefully helpful to the network. So really, again, this presentation is to set some shared context. The basic outline that I'm going to use is I'm going to talk about emissions and energy, and I'm going to talk about equity and the economy. And I think those are going to really be the through lines of this whole day. This is one slide that kind of puts it all together in one place. what you see is our energy use here in the blue bubbles, our Vermont's emissions here in the green, and this is energy sector emissions. This does not include non-energy, but our emissions from energy use are 80% of emissions in Vermont. And then energy burden, or this is the cost to Vermonters, the average family, of how much they spend on these different sources of energy. And so what you can see here, these are all scaled to size, is that whether we're talking about energy use, and this is primarily fossil fuels, whether we're talking about emissions, or whether we're talking about impacts on family budget, most of what is going on is in the transportation and thermal sectors. Certainly more so relative to the amount of attention and kind of ink, et cetera, that is devoted to electricity generation. So most of this presentation is going to focus here, and I think the rest of the day as well. So that's, I'm going to get to where we stand in a second, but I want to start by putting that in a broader context of where we're trying to go. So as many of you know, 2016 Comprehensive Energy Plan, the headline goal from that is 90% renewable by 2050. And this is basically the progress that we have made to date. We've, gone from perhaps around 12% renewable as a share of total energy use back right before 2010 to about 19 or 20% today. Almost all of this progress has been because of the increasing renewability of our electricity generation sector. But if we're going to not stay on this kind of business as usual line, but instead bend the curve, what it's going to take is changing the energy use of the transportation and thermal sectors, in large part by electrifying them, but also by using efficient and renewable solid and liquid fuels as well. On the right, so you can see we've we're at an important inflection point. On the right, there are many emissions reduction goals in statute, in administrative targets like the Comprehensive Energy Plan. The one that we have done most of our modeling backwards from is the Paris Climate Agreement, because A, that's the nearest term. It has a 2025 deadline. And it also is what Governor Scott committed to 2 years ago when the president said that he was going to wanted to pull the United States out of the Paris Agreement. Governor Scott said that he was committing Vermont to meet the Paris Climate Agreement goals of 26 to 28% below our 2005 levels by 2025. As of the latest data from 2015, we are only 2% below our 2005 levels, or less than a tenth of the way there. So however you look at it, our renewable energy goals or our emissions reduction goals, we have very important work to do. This slide I want to spend a little bit of time on because I know it can be so confusing to some folks. So let's start with the blue. This is our actual emissions. Again, this comes from DEC's emissions inventory for the state. And on the y-axis, we see million metric tons of CO2 equivalent. It's a metric for all greenhouse gases. Not just CO2, but methane and others. And, we started at about 8.6 million metric tons in 1990. And, we've gone up and down, but right now we're, as of the latest data in 2015, here at 9.9. Those are big numbers. They're weird terms that a lot of people aren't familiar with. So I want to just pause to put them in a little bit of context. And that is, you can think of 1 million metric tons as the equivalent of burning 2.3 million barrels of oil. So 10 million metric tons, where we were at basically in 2015, is the equivalent of burning 23 million barrels of oil. Another way is that 1 million metric tons is what is polluted from 216,000 passenger cars operating for 1 year. To bring it down to more of a personal level, the average Vermonter in a year emits 15 tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. Most of that, between 5 to 7 tons a year, comes from our personal vehicles, and the next largest is usually those of us who heat our homes with fossil fuels. So that gives a little bit of a sense of scale. The other important thing to say about this, or an other important thing to say about this, is these green dots represent either goals or commitments that the state has made. This was a statutory goal from 2013, I believe, that was missed. This is another statutory goal for 2028. This shows what we would have to do to meet the Paris Agreement. And these green dots show the goals for the Comprehensive Energy Plan. So there's multiple emissions reduction goals and commitments out there. The other thing that's important to note is that we are going in the wrong direction. From 2013 to 2015, our latest data, we went up our emissions went up, I can't remember if it's 13 or 16%, but you can see right there, they went up. So let's, to put a finer point on it, break it down by sector in Vermont. Most of them are coming from transportation, from thermal. We actually have more emissions from agriculture than we do from electricity generation, but combined, these 3 green bars, our electricity emissions, account for over 80% of Vermont's emissions. This is a chart taken directly from DEC's emissions inventory, and I want to pause on it because oftentimes there's a confusion in translation between the national energy conversation that we have and the state energy conversation that we have. Nationally, you read articles in national publications, and they often use the terms electricity and energy interchangeably, as though the whole energy story is about electricity. One of the reasons for that is that for a long time, the biggest single source by sector of emissions in the United States was the electricity generation sector. That was the case in 2015. Now, actually, for the more recent data, transportation nationally has become the single largest source of emissions, surpassing electricity generation. But in Vermont, that has never been the case. Electricity generation, throughout most of the recorded, history of at least the last 30 years, has always been incredibly low carbon, low emitting in Vermont. And so where most of the challenge lies, where most of the work has to be done, is here and here, which is why it's important not to just kind of import or think about what is being proposed nationally and apply it to Vermont, because we have different circumstances, and it's that much more important to focus on how we get around and how we heat our buildings and homes. So it's not just that transportation and heating make up the largest source of our emissions. It's also that those are the sectors where most of our increase in the last few years is coming from. So again, this is from the emissions inventory that the state does. You can see back in 1990, about 3.4 million metric tons. Now we're at about 4.3. That's a 700,000 ton increase. One of the questions that people often ask is, wait, how are we seeing increasing emissions from the transportation sector when fuel efficiency standards for vehicles are improving? And it's because it's not just about fuel efficiency, it's about the choice of vehicles, of those who purchase and use vehicles are making. And this, this has been a long running story. This just shows data from the last 4 years, but Vermonters are increasingly choosing larger, bigger, more polluting vehicles than we were previously. Instead of 30% of new vehicle purchases being passenger cars in 2015, it was 20% last year. This is the story in the thermal sector, or as the inventory calls it, the residential, commercial, industrial fuel use. This is primarily fuel used for space heating and water heating in homes and buildings. And you can see 2.4 million metric tons up to about 2.8, about 400,000 tons. So again, not only the biggest share of our emissions, but where most of the increase is coming from as well is those sectors. And then electricity, this is the picture. And I'll just note, look here at the scale. You know, the difference between these is 500,000 tons. The difference between these is 200,000. So this looks a lot more volatile than the others, but the scale is different, which had to be done because the emissions from this sector are so much smaller. So I'm not going to spend too much more time on it, except to say that because our electricity sector is so clean, no matter how you measure it, that is why we get such a double benefit from electrifying how we heat our homes and how we get around, how we can solve these two challenges, in addition, again, to replacing fossil fuel use with solid and liquid renewable fuels where appropriate. Okay, so now I'm going to switch to energy. So again, 90% renewable is a total energy goal. As of the latest data, Vermont was 19% renewable. Again, you know, most of that is because of the renewability of the electricity sector, but because it's so small, it doesn't move this number up much. If we're going to increase the share of this pie, we need to enlarge these pies in the thermal and transportation sectors. And I'll just note that when, for instance, additional EVs are registered and used in Vermont, when cold climate heat pump systems are used in Vermont, we had a choice to make in the modeling. Do we include that in the electricity pie, or do we include that transportation energy in these pies? And so these show there's a very small amount for electric vehicles that's in here to include it in transportation, and a somewhat larger but still relatively small amount for cold climate heat pumps and other efficient electric heating and some electric heating here in the thermal sector. So this is how it breaks down where the renewability of these pies comes from. And you know, it's not all an unvarnished kind of positive story. In transportation, you know, many of you might be familiar with the life cycle analysis of the emissions that go into creating corn-based ethanol, and you know, is that actually reducing emissions or is it increasing them? But you know, EVs are a very tiny sliver right now of the renewability of this sector. And this is an important, you know, renewability is not the same thing as low carbon or low emissions necessarily. In some cases it is. In most cases it is. You can see the renewability of our thermal sector is mostly cordwood, pellet stoves, some automated wood heat, and electric heat. And then this shows the renewability of the electric sector post renewable energy credit accounting, most of which in the end ends up being hydro, as you see there. Okay, so that's kind of where we stand. What's it going to take to meet these key goals? This is modeling that was led by Lee Seddon, and we wanted to ask the question, there's not one path to get there, but what is a path that could get us to Vermont's Paris commitment? Given our knowledge of known and proven technologies, peer-reviewed best practices where we've got you know, defensible data to extrapolate from. So again, most of the action is in these two sectors, transportation and thermal. And there's been a lot of attention that, you know, electric vehicles, replacing 90,000 fossil fueled vehicles in the next 6 years with electric vehicles is the single largest driver, which it is. But another way to look at it is because there are so many solutions in our thermal sector, when you add up all of these drivers, it actually adds up to a bigger opportunity for emissions reduction sector-wide here in thermal. So, you know, you can see, and then here at the bottom, again, these are in the annual report if you want to refer to it, it shows what our current status is. but really it's about reducing vehicle miles traveled, whether that's through transit, microtransit, on-demand, shared transit, whether it is walking or biking, however we reduce overall vehicle miles traveled. It's about increasing fuel efficiency, something that has the influence of other states and our federal government is big here. But for those Vermonters who do have cars, who do need cars to get around, which are most, this is going to be the single largest driver for the state. And then here in the thermal sector, you can see that there are many options, starting with weatherization, and then ways to heat your home without fossil fuels include, in combination, whether it's water heating, cold climate heat pump water heaters, advanced wood heating systems, the automated pellet boilers, pellet stoves, heat pump systems, etc. So this is just to show a little bit about what would it look like from getting from where we are to there on each of those drivers. And I should say that, this isn't a menu of options. It's not like we can say, well, we'll just pick this one and we'll be good. It would require all 10 of these, plus an additional 20% that is not modeled from somewhere else. We modeled the 80% that the energy sector is responsible for, not from waste and agriculture. That is going to have to be captured over here. So it has to be all of those or their equivalent. So if we fall short of 90,000 EVs in the next 6 years, replacing fossil fuel vehicles, then one of these other bars is going to have to increase to offset it. So these are just some ramp rates that show, our current growth rate and trajectory, and how we would have to get more serious and be investing more ambitiously to meet some of these goals. So this is homes weatherized. Back in 2007, there was a goal established in statute of weatherizing 80,000 homes by 2020. We're at 25,000. So if we were going to meet that, that would be, 55,000 homes in the next year. This is what it looks like for advanced wood heat, including efficient pellet stoves. And this lighter green bar models increasing automated wood heating systems. Not quite as steep of a growth rate. This would be heat pump systems. We've seen a very rapid growth rate here, and it's going to have to continue. And then here's electric vehicles. So one of the things I want to pause on here is going back to the equity theme. All of these, I should say, most of what is modeled here is not asking low-income Vermonters to change their behavior, change their purchasing patterns first. The way that primarily we're going to achieve this, or we'll achieve this, or this, or this, is in homeowners, not renters, and making a different choice when it comes time to buy a new car or buy a new heating system. And so, for instance, let's look at the data for new vehicle sales in Vermont. We average around, a little over 100,000 vehicles sold a year. Only a third of them are new. And yes, of course, once we buy a new electric, folks who are buying new cars, buy electric vehicles, those will eventually hit the used market. But most of what's modeled for the next 5 years is decisions that folks of means can make, and it's not focusing on folks who are stretched thin, having to make a change to in their lives right away. Transit is also incredibly important here. It is not just an EV story, of course. So with all of that, I want to now focus on this is my favorite. It's like picking your favorite children, right? Like, this is my favorite infographic from EAN's. I have lots of other favorites, but bear with me. One of the things that we wanted to look at is, okay, if we've got this enormous challenge and opportunity ahead of us. Who's already done this? What can we learn from the places whose emissions haven't increased 16% since 1990 like they have in Vermont? And so we looked at every state across the country, we looked at every province in Canada, and we wanted to answer two things. What are the places that have reduced their emissions below 1990 levels successfully, and that have lower per capita emissions than Vermont? There are a lot of places that have reduced their emissions below 1990 levels, but they have much higher per capita emissions than Vermont. They were able to reduce their emissions because they had primarily coal-fired electricity, which is not our situation. And what we found is that there's 3 states that have reduced their emissions below 1990 levels and that have lower per capita emissions than Vermont. And they are California, Massachusetts, and New York. And the 2 highest performing Canadian provinces were Quebec and British Columbia. And the consistent theme that you see, whether you look at the United States, Canada, whether you look at other countries, is that the only places that are successfully rapidly reducing emissions and, oh, by the way, growing their economies, as you'll see when we chart the emissions versus GDP in the next few slides, are places that have in some way required emissions reduction. Some places have done it through a cap and invest system. Some have done it with fees on carbon fuels. Some have done it with legal mandates like Global Warming Solutions Act. There are different models here, but we did not find evidence of any place successfully doing this on a voluntary basis. There needed to be legal requirements in place for emissions caps that brought them down over time. And so California, which has probably been the most successful in the United States, and Quebec decided to do that by placing a cap, not just, so Vermont's somewhat familiar with this already because we have a cap and invest program that caps our emissions from the electricity sector. And then if utilities can't come, or generators can't come in under that, they have to buy allowances to pollute. And then that revenue is used to invest primarily through, in Vermont, Efficiency Vermont and weatherization. But we have only capped and required emissions reduction from our smallest energy sector, 10% of our energy. What California and Quebec said is, let's apply that successful model to every energy sector, economy-wide, including emissions from transportation and from thermal. One of the reasons that New York and Massachusetts have made more progress than Vermont is they started with more emissions from their electricity sector. So they got more of an emissions reduction benefit out of participating in the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. So, you know, and there are other models as well, but the key lesson is that unless you cap emissions and require emissions reduction, there's no evidence of states, provinces, countries, anywhere successfully meeting those goals. So what did that look like in Quebec? Here is the emissions reduction, 10% below 2000 levels, but they also ended up below 1990 levels. There's their economic growth. Here's what it looked like in British Columbia, which used a carbon fee system instead of a cap and invest system. Here's what it looked like in California. And these bars show when they implemented carbon pricing, when they implemented cap and invest program, and you see these gaps became even wider between this decoupling of economic performance from emissions is incredibly heartening. Here's what Vermont looks like instead. Okay, so I want to focus on the benefits. And I don't want to be kind of glib about this, but because of Vermont's unique economy and situation, in large part, this is an opportunity disguised as a challenge. Why do I say that? So most of you know that Vermont imports 100% of the fossil fuel that we use. On an individual level, the most volatile prices, and historically the highest price way to heat your home or your business, whatever, is propane in the purple and fuel oil in the blue. Combined, that's where over 50% of Vermont's heating comes from, is these two highest cost, most price volatile fuels come from. We bolded the renewable options instead, so you can see how stable those prices are and how low those prices are compared to the fossil fuel alternatives. So this is a massive opportunity for affordability and savings for Vermonters when they move from these awful roller coasters when you're getting $800, $1,000, fuel oil bills in, the middle of winter, to a more predictable and low cost fuels, whether that's electricity or wood pellets or wood chips in the right applications. From a macro economy perspective, this is a massive drain on Vermont's economy. What these numbers are depend on the wholesale and retail price of fossil fuels, but generally anywhere from 70 to 80 cents of every dollar that we spend on fossil fuel drains right out of Vermont. We have about a $33 billion economy, and our fossil fuel spending is anywhere from $1.5 to $2 billion. That is a massive outflow of dollars that is not supporting Vermont jobs. It's supporting economies like those of Saudi Arabia and Russia. So this is modeling that the EIC did, that and it's kind of, it's kind of rough, but it basically was a thought exercise of, if instead over the last 5 years, if Vermont drivers had been driving with electric vehicles versus gas vehicles, what would the savings have been? So this is a massive economic opportunity, whether you look at it from equity and affordability, whether you look at it from our statewide economy and the jobs we can create, or money recirculating and growing our economy. This is another metric of EV savings versus gas savings. And there's many places. I remember the press release from Burlington Electric Department with different charging rates that can be the equivalent of 60 cents a gallon. And I'm sure it's similar for other utilities in the state. The other thing is that this has been one of the few bright spots in terms of job creation in Vermont. If you look back 6 years ago, we had fewer than 15,000 jobs in clean energy. Now we have about 19,000. So 4,000 new jobs added in clean energy in the last 6 years, most in energy efficiency and renewable energy. And there's a lot of room to grow in the transportation sector. And of course, there are enormous health benefits of avoided things like asthma and respiratory admissions, et cetera, that are related to our fossil fuel use. This is just one analysis from the American Lung Association that looks at the health impacts of what are in, that are not priced into, but are a social cost to our fossil fuel use for vehicles. So all of this is background context to us wanting to say, as Lee mentioned, EAN started with a systems mapping exercise. How are we going to achieve this transition together? That was first started, about a decade ago. And we wanted to ask ourselves the question, is that systems map still accurate? Do we need to update it in certain ways? And given how Vermont's energy landscape is changing, what are some new opportunities for progress? So we identified 24 members from across the network who are willing to volunteer 4 full days over the past year to dig into that question with us, to help us identify gaps in research that we needed to fill to help move the state forward, and to help basically create the process that we're in the that we're experiencing today, and that is culminating in these pitches you will hear this afternoon for new opportunities to get Vermont back on track for its energy and climate goals. So you'll see, a diversity across this Energy Future initiative from the last year, by sector, by geography, et cetera. These are others. Apologies for the smaller pictures from some folks. Just, slides putting together. And so, we did some fairly complex systems analysis, which I'm not going to walk through right now, but one of the kind of rough rubrics that we used was, the leverage points that have been identified to change Vermont's energy system are these four here on the left-hand side: policy and regulatory reform, public engagement, technology innovation, and capital mobilization. And so, we can either think total energy or we can break that down by sector. And we said, there's a lot of work that we could be doing at the intersection of each of these. What is going to be the most timely and strategic and important for this moment in time? And so as part of that, one of the things that we did is some storytelling. We basically asked a lot of people who were there at the creation, who made these changes, what was the story of how Vermont's electricity sector became so much more efficient and so much more renewable? And it was clear that there was a baseline of available technology to be able to move away from fossil fuel generation to things like hydro and wind and solar, et cetera. And that there was a policy framework that was put in place over the years, as Lee mentioned, whether that was standard offer, net metering, the renewable energy standard, there were clear policy signals. And going back to that previous graph where I showed the policy requirements, Vermont only having a policy requirement for the electricity sector, but not for transportation and thermal. Again, there was clear rules of the road and targets that had to be met for this sector. And that's been a massive success story. To find success stories in the transportation and thermal sectors, we had to look outside of our borders. One of the biggest success stories in transportation has been Norway, which now has more than half of their new vehicles sold as electric vehicles. And one of the things that they did is that they charge fees on fossil fuel vehicles to account for the pollution and the harm that they create, both health-wise to our economy, to the environment. And then there were fees on fossil fuel vehicles, and then they used that revenue to heavily subsidize and promote EVs instead. And this, as you'll hear later, Linda's going to go in depth on this a little bit more. I'm sorry. You can see how these lines crossed. This was fossil fuel vehicles. This is electric vehicles, and they're going to be 100% zero emission vehicles by 2025 because they were not afraid to use a policy framework that said, we're going to account for this price and we're going to incentivize the alternative. The thermal sector, we looked at the example of Upper Austria, which now has about half of its heating from renewable sources, primarily from sustainably managed biomass via automated wood pellet boilers. Again, in comparison, Vermont's thermal sector is 19% renewable. And this is a good, comparison, topography, climate, population-wise. And they boiled their successful approach for how they did this down to one phrase. They used sticks, carrots, and tambourines. You need the policy and regulatory framework to set the rules of the road and give market certainty. You need the carrots or the incentives to move to the alternative, and you need to celebrate success and engage consumers and the public in the transition. And so when we looked at those three stories, this is not a comprehensive review, but anecdotally, it became very clear that they had a common arc to them. Once there was a baseline level of technology alternatives, a policy framework was put in place that then drove the transition most of the rest of the way. And other things like capital mobilization and public engagement were incredibly important, but you can only make so much progress without that policy framework. And for a long time, we've had technology alternatives and solutions on the electricity generation side. But I think it's worth stepping back and just taking stock of this moment where, so one thing that we do every year in this annual progress report is we have this chart, which will show you, if you look, there's a 2010 baseline, so we can see where we were on each of these different goals and where we were for adoption of key solutions. It's amazing. You look back to 2010, how many electric vehicles were there in Vermont? Fewer than 100. In 2010, there were 0 cold climate heat pump systems in Vermont. In 2010, there were fewer than 60 automated wood heating systems. And all of those have started to take off with some targeted both private sector innovation and public sector support. So now we're at the point where the technological alternatives are there for the transportation and thermal sectors. We have the solutions we need. We just do not have the policy framework to drive it in the way that we did in our own electric sector, the way that Norway did for vehicles and transportation, and the way that Upper Austria has done for their heating sector. And so stepping back and thinking about that, we said, you know, there's a lot of work to do. It would be very difficult to focus on all of these things. We need progress in all of them. This isn't saying one or the other, it's both and more. But it became clear that as a network, there was a sense in the initiative that we needed to focus on these two sectors, and that given where we are at this moment in time for the thermal and transportation sectors, without clear policy requirements and mandates and goals, that we needed new ideas for policy and regulatory reform in those sectors, and we needed to do a better job at public engagement so that people know that all those solutions that were unknown in 2010 are available, will save folks money, and can improve our economy, environment, and affordability. So, where we are now is that, you know, that's what we used to do our call for pitches. We said we particularly want to hear pitches in the thermal and transportation sectors. You will hear 3 about transportation, 3 about thermal, and 3 others that touch on both of those because they're really total energy pitches. And 7 of the 9 are really policy and regulatory reform focused, and 2 of the 9 are more demonstration or pilot projects that could ramp up for successful public engagement. So I don't believe I have any. So this is just the summary of that presentation, and hopefully I've done an adequate job of at least giving us all a little bit of common context for the conversations we're going to have today. And there should be, if you don't have it with you, there are extra copies of our annual progress report if you want to refer to it at any time throughout the day on the registration table. We'll bring some in as well. Most of what you saw in this presentation is in that report, and we're going to make an updated, newer one with great helpful infographics for next year. So if you've got ideas for analysis that you want to see, questions you had about this, please talk to Carolyn, myself, Lee, others, because after this summit, we'll start working on mapping out our next annual progress report and the type of information and analysis that we want to get from the network and share back out to the network to help us all make faster progress together. Thank you.